Good evening, everyone. My name is Emily Towns. I'm Dean of the Divinity School, and it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce our Howard Herod Lecturer for 2018. Howard L. Herod Lecture was established in honor of Herod, the Oberlin Alumni Professor of Social Ethics and the Sociology of Religion. Professor Herod, who died in 2003, was on our faculty for some 34 years. He wrote widely with several books devoted to ethics and to Native American religions and cultures. The Herod Lectures, which began in 2004, are intended to deal with, the three general fields of Herod's interests: social ethics, sociology of religion, and Native American religions and cultures. This year's Herod Lecturer is the Reverend Dr. Maisha I. Kariamu Handy, who is the Vice President of Academic Affairs Provost at the Interdenominational Theological Center. She is also Associate Professor of Religion and Education and in her 18th year there. Handy has a BA from Lincoln University, her MDiv with honors from Candler School of Theology, and a PhD in religion, focusing in theology and personality from Emory. As administrator, professor, minister, and activist, Dr. Handy is committed to the struggle for justice and liberation as a womanist scholar practitioner. During her tenure as a faculty member at the ITC, Dr. Handy served as the Black Women in Church and Society Womanist Scholar. From 2006 to 2007, she is the author of Fighting the Matrix Toward a Womanist Pedagogy for the Black Church. That is an article in the Journal of the Interdenominational Theological Center, and co-author of the article Getting Real. In the book, Keep It Real, Working with Today's Black Youth. Dr. Handy founded the Holla If You Hear Me Hip Hop Forum, a series that engages the hip hop generation, the church, and the academy in community dialogue. Dr. Handy was appointed by the Association of Theological Schools as the historically Black Theological Schools peer group, and was a reporter for that group, Educational Models and Practices Initiative. She continues her work in higher education administration as a womanist committed to the unique HBCU experience of theological education found at the ITC. Dr. Handy's work is inextricably connected to her work as a pastor who is building a radically inclusive community that strives to live out the clarion call of liberation theologies. Known as Pastor K, Dr. Handy is a minister and theologian who is dedicated to pastoral mentoring and prophetic preaching. She currently serves as the pastor, then, of Rise Community Church, R-I-Z-E, Community Church in Atlanta, Georgia. Dr. Handy was licensed in 1991 and ordained in 1994 to the gospel ministry at First Baptist Congregational Church of Chicago, a union of Baptist and UCC denominations, and ordained as a ruling elder in the Presbytery of Greater Atlanta in 2011. She is currently a minister of Word and Sacrament in the Presbyterian Church, USA. As pastor of Rise, Handy works with the leadership team to develop a growing and thriving Afrocentric church community that strives to bring healing and transformation to the world by the Holy Spirit and the liberating power of Jesus Christ and the church. Her topic for this year's Herod Lecture is, "This is my body broken for you: Intersectionality, Ritual Practice, and Creative Justice." Please join me in welcoming Dr. Maisha Handy to the lectern and back to Vanderbilt.
Thank you so much, Dr. Towns, for that introduction. I'm going to come to my formal acknowledgments in just a minute. Tonight, I break away from perhaps normative approaches to an annual seminary lecture. I begin with bodies. Bodies not disconnected from the earth and the vast expanse of space and the universe, but very much a part of the environments and ecosystems and the very ground they embrace and defy with movement. Dancing bodies. Bodies moving, stretching, reaching, creating, expanding boundaries, and yes, broken for you. Not necessarily due to physical trauma, though some may be, but shattered because of stories they hold and fragmented by the process of journeying with others. I invite you, as part of this lecture and not separate from it, to see and to think and to feel, and if you choose, to move. To engage black and brown bodies, weaving creativity across time and space and places. Resisting the pedagogies of imprisonment, challenging oppositional energies that would render them worthy of death just for being. Bodies connecting through communal consciousness and cultural retentions. Intentionally mimicking other bodies and creating new forms and ways of being as they live into freedom. Body, mind, spirit serves as the first voice of this lecture. I will then return for some acknowledgments and the larger corpus of the lecture for this evening. In the spirit of what some communities of black people have named new African traditions, some of us have adopted the act of asking for permission to speak or to proceed from the eldest person in the room. Since that permission already came through the invitation of Dr. Towns, my womanist elder, I have decided to honor my womanist sisters who share their gifts at this institution and beyond by including their work in this lecture. This intends not to serve as a cursory shout-out, but as a serious acknowledgement of the scholarship produced by those I consider colleagues whose work contributes to the survival and wholeness of community. And so, to Vanderbilt Dean, Divinity School Dean, and E. Rose and Leona B. Carpenter, Professor of Womanist Ethics and Society, Dr. Emily Towns, thank you so much for extending the invitation to share this lecture. As a womanist and interdisciplinary scholar, administrator, and congregational practitioner, I continue to be grateful for your work and for your legacy among us. I will never forget attending the American Academy of Religion and Society for Biblical Literature Conference in 1997 in San Francisco, where I made my first presentation at the Womanist Approaches to Religion and Society section. The coexisting trepidation and awe is still quite real and visceral when I reflect upon staring out from the panelist table into a sea of womanist legends. A troubling in my soul had become a Bible for me and so many other blossoming doctoral students. And now, my research and thoughts would be heard. The affirmation, both during the Q&A and the conversations directly after, would become instantly building blocks for a foundation of my womanist confidence and boldness. In their absence, to my dear friends, Dr. Stacy and Juan Floyd Thomas, I'm ever grateful for their presence in my life and their work here at Vanderbilt through the Black Religious Scholars Group of the American Academy of Religion. Dr. Stacy is sick, and I told her to stay away with her germs, but she is here with me in spirit, and I continue to marvel at our ongoing connections in the academy and beyond since our days as seminarians at Candler School of Theology at Emory University. To my other colleague, who is also sick tonight, something going on in Nashville, Dr. Melissa Fenelon-Snar. It would have been good to be with her as well. We came to know each other as fledgling seminarians at Candler as well in the days when we had much theological wrestling to do under the late Dr. James Fowler. Dr. Herb Marbury, who I've also known for many years, and who, as a student at the ITC, connected as my colleague in a liberation theology class one summer at Candler. I continue to appreciate your work and friendship and shout you out as an ITC alum. To the students, administrators, and faculty of Vanderbilt Divinity School and others who may be here representing other schools at the university, I bring you greetings. And to my former students who are here, Michelle Shaw, who I knew would be here, I appreciate you being here as well and your support. This lecture serves as an opportunity to share musings, some old and some new, some in process. It is a way to think out loud about scholarship and religious practices as I move through the institutions and communities I engage on a weekly basis. I am not an ethicist by discipline, but believe through my own educational philosophy that we must include ethical considerations as the ever necessary so what, regardless of our points of departure. Despite common belief, I am not a Christian education professor in the field of religious education solely, but my PhD, as has already been stated in the introduction, was interdisciplinary, and now is a department called Persons, Community, and Religious Life. So it captures the intersections of my questions and work, which also include religion and education, hip-hop studies, and human development, all through a womanist lens. I am clear, based on data from the Association of Theological Schools and other sources, that students coming to seminary are decreasingly interested in becoming senior or full-time pastors or in congregational ministries at all. And I'm clear that seminaries need to pay attention to these data and how they drive enrollment, retention, recruitment, placement, etc. But today I choose to reflect on my experiences as a womanist, artistic Presbyterian pastor of Rise Community Church, a predominantly black and relatively new worshiping community, 5 years old, and so not chartered yet as a congregation of the PCUSA, but close, as a point of departure for this lecture. I understand that my experiences as a pastor are not separate from my intersectional self, which includes other particularities, including Vice President of Academic Affairs, Provost, but is no less rigorous. Other subjectivities will show up in this lecture, and I remain very interested in sharing womanist ways of being a higher education administrator and the challenges that come with this. But I intentionally state that I am more than all of this, even as I am particularly all of this. I am also intentional about particularity by leaning this lecture into my ministerial vocation, as manifested in the context of a particular uncategorized, uncharted worshiping body, because it is not separate from the discipline we now call at the ITC religion and education. Like the music I produce, which I never feel fits distinctly into any defined genre, I choose to both clearly identify my lenses, lest they be erased by any fear of difference, while at the same time resist any attempts to solely locate myself in any category. This task becomes challenging when I must use language to talk to you. So I'm lifting the places where the revolutions of identity and concomitant real-life experiences have been both chosen, but also, in the words of Audre Lorde, manifest as I do battle where I am standing. I forgot I had to do a little extra click here, excuse me. There it is. Rise is aptly named because of inspiration received from the 2005 documentary about youth in South Central LA who crafted their own dance forms in response to fierce interlocking oppressions present in their context. These brilliant young people, guided by the wisdom of elders, craft what they called their own ghetto ballet, a genre that is fully embodied, requiring a full range of emotional expression, sweat and tears, creative mock battles, and yes, spirituality, which is fully captured on film. Rise Community Church is an inclusive community comprised largely of millennials at a time when many have left the church. Some never experienced church, while others identify church trauma, and yet others say they are church babies and staunch Presbyterians and have always been deeply connected to the church. Some are learning Christianity. Others practice or are still practicing Ifa, and yet others identify simply as spiritual, a common designation for their generation, but one, I think, that includes a clarion call toward authenticity. In their understandings of spirituality, many millennials are seeking spaces that provide opportunities for them to show up fully while also learning and engaging tradition. In the spirit of the Akan people of Ghana, West Africa, they embrace Sankofa, the intentional practice of going back and fetching it. Lessons, traditions, experiences from the past, best practices, and bringing them forward into the now to contribute to a viable future. They are not invested in doing so in disembodied ways or in ways that compartmentalize their being. It is in these kinds of spaces through ritual practice connected to religious life that I believe models for creative justice are present. The first part of this lecture title points toward my interest in sharing work related to understandings of ritual practices that embody, literally and not just symbolically, what I call creative justice. Sacrament as a ritual practice of the church is sacred mystery. If referencing the most two common sacraments, baptism and communion, they involve very direct interactions with bodies. We often theologize, denominationally and beyond, about what the sacrament does for the embodied one, but seldom note what the body feels in sacramental ritual. And as womanist theologian M. Sean Copeland suggests, that the body itself can become a locus of perpetual sacrament. She notes, quote, "The body constitutes a site of divine revelation and thus a basic human sacrament. In sacramental reception, Jesus' self-gift of his own body nourishes, strengthens, and orders us as we make his body visible through our own body practices of solidarity," unquote. It is through this notion of perpetually embodied sacramentality in solidarity that I frame my considerations. That Jesus' dusty feet and probably worn body had feelings before the crucifixion. This socio-political revolutionary, I found out as a youth in Baptist training union class through my youth ministry, actually went to the bathroom. Her way of helping us to move away from a solely deified conception of Jesus that did not involve the everyday ordinary functions of the body. I am also contending that many communities of faith, in their understandings of either taking up one's cross or becoming a living sacrifice, invite or are open to only certain kinds of bodies to participate in redemptive work, however that is understood. Therefore, living in and through moral agency is not radically inclusive work, but the work of homogeneous aggregations. We see many signs that say all are welcome, but welcome to conform and leave the fully authentic self at the door. Intentionally resisting any awareness of an unspoken expectation to use linear theory as a beginning, I begin with narratives that capture two very real lived scenarios as points of departure for understanding ritual practice as living Holy Communion, raising critical questions for theological discourses and practices, again in multiple contexts. The late Dr. Katie Geneva Camden and our great ancestor called them biotexts. They serve as representations of a particular identification on the spectrum of simultaneously existing identities and multiple selves. They are both broad and narrow. As a way of capturing what I call creative justice, I then point us toward the intersection of liturgical practices and the arts, suggesting implications for pedagogies in multiple contexts. I engage scholarship as well as the art of dance and popular culture through the music of Esperanza Spalding, weaving the voices from biotext throughout the ritual practices of Rise Community Church. We are part of the earth, the environment, and the ecosystems that sustain us. What a tragedy to live in ways that don't fully regard and embrace our bodies, all bodies, as they choose to be. The first body. In 2015, a beautiful woman stepped onto the platform area where the pulpit sits, but is moved back at Rise Community Church. She prepares to share her gift for a liturgical moment during the service called Testify, a ministry present from Rise's beginning and designated to create space for telling of God's presence in one's life through the arts. Initially facilitated by a spoken word and a hip-hop artist, gifts of word flow, or NOMO as we called it, dance, song, as well as good old-fashioned testimonies are shared after the passing of the piece and before the choir's sermonic selection. Adorned in a long, flowing yellow gown suited for liturgical dance, curly black hair cascading down her back, and platform heels that would give Beyonce a run for her money, she graced the front of the church. The brother in the balcony controlling the sound equipment cued the music, and the voice of Beverly Crawford singing gospel music filled the sanctuary. With no prior introduction, because I, as the pastor, was led by Spirit to just let it happen with no prefacing, a ministry of movement emerged that included dramatic lip syncing and gestures fitting one experiencing a Vicki Winans or a Karen Clark Sheard concert. My eyes scanned the room as tears of joy welled in the eyes of several members of the congregation. Others stood up clapping their hands, yet others sat stoically or with a look of surprise. Because the young millennial man that they had just seen serving as an usher at the door was also the woman in the pulpit, sharing her gift of drag in the church. I would later have opportunity to speak with parishioners and those we call first-time kin. One young woman shared how liberating the experience was for her as a seminarian who grew up in an evangelical Pentecostal church in the North, who was now in a relationship with a woman and journeying through how to claim her identities in all of the spaces she occupied. Others described in varying ways how the dance was vicariously liberating for them and how it solidified in their minds that this community was radically inclusive, open to all embodied experiences, freeing them to bring their total selves to worship. And of course, it was healing. Her dance was a balm in Gilead that gently rubbed salve onto old wounds with visible scars from battles with family, loved ones, and strangers alike, those not accepting of their humanity. Others I spoke with were first-time attendees and were completely unaware that this was the man that just greeted them at the door. They didn't recognize him, only her, and therefore experienced the dance as they would any other. Perhaps this was the truest goal. Or as Heike Puckroon notes, quote, multiple identities appear through the body as performative. That is, they are socially constituted, contextual, and only appear to be fixed or mapped onto the body. But the fluidity, multiplicity, and intersectionality of our identities make space for misrecognition, unquote. Not all of the responses were benevolent. I would also receive a call from the then Minister of Music after I posted, as I normally do, pictures from the worship service on the church's social media page. The pictures from that Sunday were a collage that included this liturgical dance. The minister said she received a call from a member of the music ministry asking that we take the picture down because they didn't want her picture next to theirs. It seemingly caused this unnamed person to wrestle with what they perceived to be moral ambiguity. This was considered a liability for a fledgling, predominantly African-American ministry, even if open and affirming. A strange perspective, as Rise clearly seeks to embrace people experiencing the trauma of marginalization, including church trauma. Or perhaps, as some continue to wrestle with their own becoming, it simply made them feel uncomfortable, exposed. But captured in this singular act of liturgical expression was the work of an advocate for equity related to sexual identities and church socio-political systems. What those assembled thought would be a traditionally fitting modern liturgical dance and gospel music conglomeration was this and much more. It was an act of creative justice through ritual practice that will rival any artistic presentation in an episode of Pose. And the dance came with a similar story. Joshua Tucker, who gave me permission to use his real names, also known by the rites of passage name Najamba Wole, affectionately called Wole by many, and by her professional name Nina LaBelle Thomas, is a professional makeup artist and competing drag queen who also walks in a self-understanding as an empath and a medium. When I approached Joshua Nina LaBelle Wole, and that will be my reference from this point forward, to share the gift of drag, as no different from any other creative expression shared to date, he remarked that he had never been invited to do so at a church, despite the long-standing legacy of gospel drag in the city of Atlanta and his long-standing membership in churches since a child. He expressed simultaneous shock and joy at the invitation, suggesting the perception that the church was a domain of power that excluded certain types of bodies, even as part of performative expressions, a space of aesthetic manifestation that is frequently deemed acceptable for the LGBTQAI persons in many churches, as long as they do not openly identify as such. While Rise is a Christian and interreligious space in that it includes people who practice the Yoruba religion Ifa and Christianity simultaneously, rituals that traverse both expressions of faith, it grapples, understandably, with embedded perceptions about what church is or should be. Nina's dance embodied a clarion call for the church to both practice justice and make room for just practices that serve as correctives to its own oppressive structures, rituals, and supremacies. This body, broken by the work of trying to fit into an acceptable mold and fragmented by rejection, now came together in one intentional practice of creative justice, in worship. This body, mind, spirit, and more stood as an intersectional pedagogical beckoning toward expansive understandings of sacrament, positioned as a call for communities that have already removed the line between sacred and secular in rituals, ideologically and practically, to take care not to retract this blending by relegating certain kinds of so-called secular or mundane artistic work, or of any trans or non-binary bodies that deliver it as unsuitable for sacred settings. This body, this intersectional and to some unexpected body, is faithful to ministry and communion. It is true to the self. It is sacred mystery. It is unfolding. In churches and other theological settings that, in the words of Reverend Levon Proverbs Briggs, who started our Testify ministry, worship at the altar of pronouns, how do we embrace and move beyond the trappings of gender identities, while embracing and celebrating the particularity of our embodiments, thus embracing understandings of intersectionality, not as endless abstractions, but as multiple and coexistent, distinct subjectivities? How do we creatively engage justice as the very act of choosing our bodies in radical response to white supremacy, structural violence, and the churches that support both? The second body. Holding on for dear life to the pulpit with her left hand and holding to the microphone with the other, while trying to lean into the top pier of the podium for abdominal support, but finding none, because it was built for a man of over 6 feet in height. The tremors become more pronounced by the minute. A black clergywoman stands and speaks, confronting systems of oppression through the homiletic via manuscript and the unspoken embodied homiletic that preaches a different but simultaneous word of ableism. The weekly struggle becomes performative art in its truest sense, the kind that is never just entertainment or technique, but connected to belief in life purpose and community. What Omofalabo Soyinka Ajayi calls, quote, a multi-communication channel, transmitting information not only through time and space, but also kinetically, visually, and through other human sensorial perceptions. A communication powerhouse able to give information at many levels simultaneously, unquote. Living through a rare neurological disability that causes essential tremor, in this case that manifests most pronounced orthostatically or in the leg, And in navigating what was, well after diagnosed, and it took 2 years, the very common brain-triggered anxiety that comes with seeing oneself being seen. With no known cause or cure, the shaking is exacerbated when this body remembers traversing the very real and articulated need from church people for clergy and church leaders to be well and able, as extensions of a well and able God. This body is my own, broken for communion. Every act of ministry, every song, sermon, trip to the communion table with torso fixed against the edge for support is called not only for equitable space, but for attention to the body as a site for liberative theologizing, the kind that inspires others to practice self-care and self-determination toward their bodies. Bodies that may be broken by how they choose to show up, but traits not chosen, or because they are perceived as broken because of identities, race, gender, class, sex, sexuality, and so on. But it is through the physical tremors that boundaries become illusions and borders obstacles to be transgressed. Using theology as a seemingly innocuous and even benevolent platform, are we still trying to fix or heal those who are differently able? How do we both offer presence and accommodations, when requested and how requested, while also seeing those who are differently able as much more than this, in the very moment of connected exchange? Intersectionality. In my conversation with Joshua Nina LaBelle Wole, he stated, quote, "I've been attacked physically and verbally my whole life because of how I choose to be. When I got the opportunity to ask people who have abused me why they did do it, their response is typically, because you just don't make sense to me. I don't really know why I don't like you, but it's confusing and not right," unquote. I've had my own experiences of people asking me why I'm nervous after observing me at a podium on campus, or of older people that exclaim, "You're too young to have that wrong with you." And the endless instances of people forgetting that I live with a disability because it is largely an invisible one that comes not with movement, but with standing still. It's confusing. In their 2016 work, Intersectionality, Patricia Hill Collins and Surma Bilge note the emergence of the term, whether called intersectionality or something else prior to its sticking in academia, Kimberly Crenshaw's coining of the term, the contentions around its use, and the multiple applications for a term meant to connote multiplicities and complexities. These axes of identities and ways of being that serve as manifold locales for human being, for example, gender, race, ableism, ageism, sexuality, class, epistemology, etc., a long-standing debate in discourses about intersectionality is the essentialism, identity politics, rigid categories, versus fluidity and a focus on the dynamics of power. The conversations were pushed further by Robin Henderson Espinoza, who posited Anna Louise Keating's use of interconnectivity as a way of both moving beyond what we can still see as the need for rigid categories in the use of intersectionality and the call for a more pragmatic manifestation that is relational. She notes, quote, "In rethinking structures of family and queer desire, the matrices of difference emerge quite naturally as moments of interconnectedness that mobilize the multiplicity and fullness of identity into relational connection. This approach has the capacity to reframe our efforts of faith, seeking understanding, and the ethical practices emerging from this frame. Remapping representational theologies as theologies of interconnection lends them to new moments of difference rather than immutable constraints," unquote. While I appreciate that work that moves us beyond rigidity in ways that invite us to turn our examinations toward the ways of interaction, that is, connection, relationality, power, for better or for worse, I am also screaming from the inside, why can't we do it all? It is in the very text of bodies that we see the need to move away from yet another binary argument. As Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon notes, quote, "Sometimes the gist of the creative ideas in the mining of our biotexts comes from negotiating difficult personal experiences. At other times, it is the echoing of communal realities against the deadly onslaught of stultifying intellectual mystification that grab us as participant observers in our family and community. We must take a clear-eyed look at the immediate irregularities that regulate our truth to falsehood, unquote. When asked, how old were you when you knew you embodied both feminine and masculine qualities, and I understand those also as constructs, Joshua Nina LaBelle Wole responded, I was about 11 years old. However, the discovery wasn't mine. I thought of myself as normal, quotations here, but it was the people around me, church people, peers at school, family, that told me I was girly and gay. In other words, to me, though, I was just being. How do we create spaces for people whose very embodiment is a category projected by others, and that comes with very real consequences? This is reminiscent of concerns addressed by Dr. Spumora Lomax in her recent work, Jezebel Unhinged, as she asks, how do we move discourses on black womanhood past Jezebelian tropes and whole discourses operating in culture and whole theologies functioning in the black church, unquote. Projections rooted in dangerous biblical studies and long-standing attempts to control black women's bodies. Resonant with the interlacing matrices of intersectional analyses and the deeper levels of fluidity located in interconnectivities is the work of queer theory. As Pamela Lightsey notes, quote, using a deconstructive strategy helps queer theorists and scholars to show the heterogeneity, historical context, arbitrariness, unverifiable essentialism, and identity categories, and their capacity to be deployed as mechanisms of solidarity, liberation, and oppression, unquote. I'm going to skip forward for the sake of time. Black religious scholar Anthony Penn waged an important critique of black liberation theology. In noting the disembodied approaches to theological discourses, he asserted that, quote, black theological thought related to issues of liberation and life meaning, when framed in terms of the body, tend toward the body only as an abstraction, as symbol, with little attention to the lived body. At best, with a few exceptions, black theology and its claims made and agendas drawn do not typically emanate from the body. Black theology is often a theology of non-body, a system of theological expression without an organized representation of the body as body, unquote. Further, Penn contends that black theology and womanist theology seek to detangle black bodies from the power dynamics of oppression, but, he says, if Foucault is correct, and he centralizes Foucault, another lecture for another time, such thinking is to misunderstand the nature of power and knowledge, and to assume the body has a prehistory reality, and to assume that power does not flow through and by means of black bodies as well. While I agree with much of Penn's argument and the push toward the material body, I have also attended many womanist gatherings that included poetry, the artistic painting of ancestor Katie Cannon, that graced t-shirts and booklets, that included songs and libations, tears and screams, quilts made by women's hands, all done by bodies. Talk about how those bodies felt and navigated the death-dealing realities of this world and how they thrive. As Stacey Floyd Thomas notes, quote, womanism is neither a neck up, that is disembodied, nor an ivory tower, that is elitist venture, nor is womanist epistemology a hand-me-down perspective, unquote. But I get his point. Even as the fight against systems and structures that continue to erase said bodies is ongoing, that remembering, reclaiming, and claiming of our stuff must also come through not only demanding that people put respect on our names, but that we keep our interconnected embodied ways of being at the forefront through bodily representations. One example is again found in the dance, metaphorically but also materially. In the text she edited, African Dance, Kariamu Welsh Asante asserts, quote, the ways in which true art, and not just technique, is African dance means that it is connected to belief, unquote. For Africans on American plantations, dance was camouflage for insurrectionary activity and other acts of resistance. Judith L. Hanna asserts that dance as cultural behavior is such in the sense that, quote, a people's values, attitudes, and beliefs partially determine the conceptualization of dance, as well as its physical reproduction, style, structure, content, and performance. As Pearl Primus asserted, dance is a mirror of the psychology of the people, unquote. The interconnectivity found in hip-hop culture and now strongly positioned in the Afro-punk movement serves as a new paradigm for creative justice. Interconnected bodies refusing to be categorized, dancing across time and with multiple environments in response to domains of power, advance the work of bringing to the decentralized core subjugated knowledges, practices, and frames. It is sacrament. The notion that the creator deity is manifested in and imprinted upon us. The argument for creative justice. The documenting of justice work is inexhaustible, even among communities of faith. This is also true for creative acts of justice. In the African American context, one need only to point to the ring shout in the Brush Harbor, songs of the protest movement, the artistic vehicles of hip-hop culture and its history, and with far less frequency, her story, which emerged in the American context in the Bronx as a resistance to the intersection of race-class oppression, and the more recently emerging Afro-punk movement as acts of solidarity and resistance in the struggle for justice. Creativity is the productive result of collaboration and communalism. It emerges as both critical response and empowered thriving. It is here that I find Anthony Penn's idea of creative disregard helpful. According to Penn, creative disregard means, quote, those attitudes and sensibilities that run contrary to the normative workings of societal arrangements, regulations, and are therefore considered problematic because they question what discourses of power and restrictions on life practices are meant to enforce. By unacceptable presentation, creative disregard as process and posture challenges the construction of the body as metaphor for the social system and the denied importance of the place of the body as material, unquote. This sense of disregard involves a representation of the complex body in ways that allow for alternate life meanings. It is both the critiquing and debunking of oppression and its sources, but also as the celebration of agency that is material. As Penn contends, quote, Black theological thought, like the art he discusses, should push beyond imagination through acts of creative disregard, acts that push against existing social structures and symbols, not by an effort to jettison them, but by using them, unquote. I'm going to move on. As Kelly Pollack, executive director of the Center for Creative Arts in St. Louis, argues, quote, the purpose of arts education is not necessarily to create more professional dancers or artists. It is to create more complete human beings who are critical thinkers, who have curious minds, who can lead productive lives, unquote. One such critically thinking and curious mind, or I would say in reference to Emily Town's use of the womanist dancing mind, is Esperanza Spalding, the third body. Esperanza Spalding, a Grammy Award-winning jazz bassist and now multi-genre, or better said, transgenre artist, made the decision a few years ago after doing straight-ahead jazz into her 20s and becoming the youngest person to ever join the faculty at Berklee School of Music in her 20s, to deviate from the confines of tradition. Enduring unrelenting critiques from jazz aficionados, she lifted an electric bass and released an album titled Emily's D plus Evolution, Emily being her middle name and her self-defined alter ego. This remarkable project was Spalding announcing to the world her intersectional ways of being. No longer interested in donning nice dresses and playing upright bass for tours or at the nice high official's invitation, she embraced her right to turn notions of devolving right side up. Beginning with the track Funk the Fear, she claimed her storytelling space and terrain, blending the best of jazz, funk, and blues with autobiography. Deconstruction of Religious Platitudes is really a phenomenal album. You need to go and listen to it. And full-fledged black woman desire, all through musical theater. A month ago, Spalding released a project entitled 12 Little Spells. Spalding released a song every day for 12 days, each of which corresponded to a part of the body. After instruction in the Reiki healing arts and receiving attunements, she incorporated energy healing into each song and simultaneously released videos for the audio recordings. This is being applauded as a bold move and a successful leap. Lyrically, she connects back to ourselves. She connects us back to ourselves. Her lyrics say things like, quote, legs, a physical remembering of steps taken, physically and existentially, which may have been forgotten by conscious memory. Fingers, heightened faculties of trance, touch, sense, perception in fingertips, unquote. Spalding is not just spinning another album that speaks of sexual pleasure or dance moves, but she is drawing our attention to particular body parts, one at a time, for the purpose of healing those parts through an acknowledgement of the importance of their journey and their purpose. Skipping ahead again. What then does intersectional just worship look like? What would it mean to sing various genres of music of our faith with lyrics that connect us to our bodies beyond the suffering on the cross and our ongoing participation in it? How can we redefine how we live together sacramentally in bodies? The fourth body. There is much in this picture. This is a worship service at Rise, which I inserted here as it occurred to me that it is a powerful, nonverbal example of creative justice. What you see is a Christian man, who is much more than that, dancing with an ephod priestess, who is much more than that, in a worship service focused on honoring and celebrating our ancestors. This dance occurred after a ring shout that invited the entire congregation to create movements in a circle, counterclockwise always, that represent who their ancestor, who they named aloud, meant to them and how they lived. The way in which space is created to move between Christianity and traditional African religion through the body, or as Will Coleman asserts, to understand Christianity as a traditional African religion, was paramount and celebrated. It created space for just practices, including reclamations of embodiment that occurred. Again, as Emily Towns noted in the Womanist Dancing Mind, quote, to have a womanist dancing mind means listening to the different rhythms of the sacred that come from different geographies that shape people's bodies and health. You do not two-step to the electric slide, unquote. We did a whole electric slide service, by the way. These are not only dancing minds, but dancing bodies and dancing energies, connected across continents and cultures through collective consciousness and cultural DNA. American life continues to call for a perpetual resurrection that requires the calling forth of new life daily in our planning of worship and in our understanding of what the call to worship is. Sacrament is sharing in common. It is the kind of pain and redemption that leads to transformation because the embodied one chose authenticity, and this choosing was salvific. As I close, I am always thinking about how theological educators can be intentional about intersectional space in ways that prepare seminarians for their vocational lives. I'm going to keep shouting that out because I already explained that at the beginning. In her 2015 article, Making the Way Together, Emily Towns notes, and I quote this particularly, not just because she's here again and extended the invitation, but because it is truly one of my favorite assertions that I've read as a provost. She states, quote, with particularity firing the furnace of intersectionality, we are open to a more expansive awareness and vision for our research, writing, and teaching. It also helps us think through our curricula. Far too many of us are holding on to curriculum models that are dangerously close to being on ontological suicide watch. Unquote. That thing blessed my life, you hear me? I must admit that I feel the same statement can be applied to administrative work and age-old linear approaches to how we get the work done. What does the creative academic dean look like? What do womanist approaches to administration feel like? I am still figuring this out as I work with colleagues to launch a revised master's degree in liturgical and cultural arts. I'm generally pleased to just make space for folks to push back from a conference table, stand up, and stretch our legs. I do think that we must consider embodiment and the ways in which bodies become broken in academic spaces, and how we can counter this with pedagogies that honor our total being, the full ecology of the self as connected to all around it. I bring us full circle back to Sun, Moon, Child, and interconnectivity across multiple cultural retentions. How this perhaps rested upon us as we watched it at the beginning. Must you dance or sing? Of course not. The invitation is to resist any and all existences of power that numb your senses. All of them. That tempt you to celebrate black culture, but to not love black people and black bodies, beyond commodification. To join in solidarity the work of creating spaces of revolt that welcome and make safe the choice to show up authentically. Knowing that multiple cultures as present in any so-called singular culture we can identify, contribute to any effort to transform what has been deformed. It's the invitation to piece back together freedom that has been fragmented, to let bodies live. Thank you.
We have time for questions. I will let you field them.
Yeah. My work is done. What did you feel? You don't ask me one, I'll ask one. Yes.
So having been to Rise, full disclosure, I'm very curious, the usher who gave ministry in drag, is he still a part of the community, and has that happened again?
Yes, yes, very much been there from the first year, and it's still there. We call our ushers Fahari, greeters. Very much a part of the life of the community, and it's been interesting to watch his growth and his formation. I'll just use the word ushers for the sake of conversation. The ushers do what's called our affirmation of kin, which was supposed to start out as just greeting, people who were there for the first time, explaining what Harambe is, and then passing the peace. And they kind of took ownership of it and turned it into a full-fledged affirmation of everybody present. So they come with these affirmations prepared every week, and the affirmations turned into like really powerful, I don't like the word sermonettes, but exaltations from them. And so I've watched him, just because of that invitation, that has opened up almost a space for him to share ministry in other ways. And we're at this point now actually having a conversation about his call to ministry. He's wrestling with that and thinking about that and going to seminary. So, yeah, and I was very honored just with him sharing firsthand his own words and her own story. Yes, Dr. Herb.
Dr. Handy, thank you for your lecture. I wanted to know again about to kind of piggyback on the question that Michelle just asked. How do you see patriarchy working on the body in drag in the church?
Ooh, that's a good one. I think it absolutely does. It's interesting that you asked that question because I'm actually on a dissertation committee of a student at Clark Atlanta University who's writing her dissertation on Medea, Tyler Perry's character. And of course there have been many critiques of that character and of why masses of people are so drawn to this man in drag. Some people, equate it to kind of Chitlin Circuit film, if you will. Of course, Tyler Perry isn't the first. Geraldine and Many others pre-existed that. Martin Lawrence, Big Mama's House. You kind of see that recurrence in film. It's an interesting question. I actually asked him something similar to that because there's this critique of drag as, this kind of acquiescence to patriarchy in a way, performatively. That it's just performance, that it's really you just kind of wanting to embody something other than the pain that you experience as a man, et cetera, et cetera. And he said for him, it's absolutely not that. He came at it from a more aesthetic standpoint, that he was fascinated at his ability to recreate himself and to really paint on his canvas however he chose to, whenever he chose to, and the effect that that had on other people. And so he talked about it really as a ministry of liberation for him, because people come up to him and say, I really admire you, I look up to you. He takes it very seriously. As I said, she just won a major competition around this, and works as a makeup artist. It's tricky because I've been to and experienced worship services in LGBTQAI, open and affirming churches whose theologies sounded just like the Baptist church I grew up in. Like, apart from the people sitting in the pews, the theology was very patriarchal. It was the same stuff in drag, for lack of a better word. So, I would have to ask how that shows up in his personal relationships to get a greater sense of how he's relating, over against patriarchy or not, or over against misogyny or not. But, yeah, I hear you.
Thank you so much. Do you also use visual art in your congregational ministry? I'm just struck by how beautiful and full and energized your ministry together it is. I can see it. I was just curious about that.
We do. I want to do it a lot more, actually. And whoever did this is the truth. I can't take credit for this, but this is a beautiful graphic. And when I saw it, it's actually I made it my watch face. I loved it so much because I'm so into visual art. But yes, we've had persons, one year for our church's anniversary, we had a live painter there. And she painted through the whole service and created a kind of abstract representation of our logo. I have a hip-hop artist, Joe Stu, who's a well-known hip-hop artist locally in Atlanta, who's also a painter and a tattoo artist who has done work there. I've personally have created collages. One collage I created was of between a certain time period of all of the black men and women, trans women and men who were killed wrongfully by police, and created those as a collage, and it kind of sat center on the altar. So yes, I have an artistic bunch. I have theater majors there, singers, hip-hop artists, etc. So we use visual art. I would like to be more intentional around it. Interestingly, I think the most consistent way that we use it is the church bulletin. We're very intentional about the pictures that we put on the bulletin, have created collages and things around that as well. Trying to be more eco-friendly around that because we also have a screen, but yes.
And so I've been fighting myself about whether to ask this question. I decided I would. I love what you do with the body, particularly how you make it so very personal with the this being italicized. I even love what you do with broken. But my question is, as you talk about intersubjectivity or subjectivities, who is the you? And does brokenness exist in a static fashion, or is creativity a way of actually reaching some kind of healing?
That's good. Interestingly, I jumped the italics around in this title. I wanted to focus on this is my body. Then I went to this is my body in italics. And then the you, yes. I was largely thinking about you very broadly. I talked about it as the you being the gathered community, whether that's church community, seminary community, the world, whatever our communities of significance are. For me, that is a you. I know we do it perhaps very differently depending on how we theologize around that in the church and how we understood Jesus to mean, you know, this is my body broken for you. Who he was talking to was his community gathered in that moment, those women and men. So yes, but I love this piece about creativity. For some reason, when you asked the question, back to it connected with the visual art piece, we have a grant-funded program called Where I Belong, and we do it on some Saturdays, and we look at the relationship between art and healing. And we had a sister who came in and gave us all of these cut-up pieces of paper to draw on. It had these abstract drawings, and we colored them, not knowing that they would come together, but they were broken. And as they came together creatively, they formed, again, an abstract version of our logo. I don't know why people like our logo so much, but that's what it was. And so, yes, I think you're right. I think that brokenness absolutely is not static. I'm very careful in my own personal theologizing about saying this happens in order to cause this. I kind of struggle with that even around redemptive notions of suffering. I continue to be in process about that, you know, that somebody had to suffer in order for, you know, something to come forth. But I think you're right. I think creativity both creates the brokenness, but I think I like to use in-breaking. It creates space for in-breaking and for things to come through our fragmentation into the world to bring healing and justice work and the like. So I hope that gets at it, yeah. And thank you for your question and not sitting with it.
Do you have, or can you throw up pretty quickly your church logo so we know what it is that folks are being drawn to?
Shatika. Probably because this is a PowerPoint, I would have to go on the net, yeah. But just to describe it, it says rise. The I is an Ankh, and at the top of the Ankh, people always think that this is some Holy Spirit dove, this bird that's sitting in the womb of the Ankh, but it's actually Sankofa. It's actually two things, correction. It's Sankofa and it's a phoenix. So it's a representation of the calling for people to gather who are like phoenixes who are rising out of the ashes of church trauma, of church hurt, of, you know, all of the hurt that comes with embodiment and the multiple identities and subjectivities that I've been talking about. Yeah, and the Ankh is, the logo is multicolored. Our church liturgical calendar is in 7 segments to align with the 7 chakras. Chakras being the 7 centers of energy, goes all the way back to ancient India. Can't talk about all that right now, but the colors of the chakra go from the root, which is red, all the way up to, for some, purple, others white at the crown. And so the logo moves at the bottom from red to purple at the top. And of course, you get the Womanist purple as well integrated in that. So it's really an attempt to integrate multiple ways of being, to be open to persons. We really do intentionally blend Christianity and Ifa in particular kinds of ways. So it's all of that. It's the attempt at a womanist church. You know, I was just kind of like, you know, we keep talking about this and what we don't like about the church, and I ain't never going back to that church, the patriarchy, the misogyny, et cetera. And it's like, well, let's create something else. Let's try it. Let's do it. And that does not mean that it's absent of all of the stuff that I just named. It's there. It's back to the embedded stuff that we bring even the so-called most liberated of us, but it's the commitment for us to work through it together in safe space that has, I think, caused an evolution even just in 5 years. RISE is not what I even thought or intended it to be, but that meant for me releasing it to the people and letting it become what the gathered needed it to be.